Dr. Stanwood is speaking this evening about a fascinating topic that reveals not only late 17th century European fantasies about America, but an insight into their perception of New York politics as the former Dutch colony matures under British rule. We will discover that perceptions are not static, but like society itself, undergoes constant change. This is what makes being a historian really exciting. Please help me welcome Dr. Owen Stanwood.
Thanks so much, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been following the Leisler Institute since it was founded. I think before it even moved to Hudson when I was a grad student, way back decades ago, and it's a pleasure to actually finally be here and be able to see it. And thanks also to Brenda and to everyone at Hudson Area Library for the warm welcome. Today I want to tell a story about a story and about a storyteller. And I want to think more broadly on the role of stories in history and how stories reflect or do not reflect what actually happened in the past. I also want to talk about lies and what we as historians do when we encounter them. But the story I'm focusing on today is a peculiar one. It is about pirates and Indians and unicorns and cannibalism, among many other things. It also concerns Jacob Leisler and takes place partly in early New York, which is my excuse for coming to talk about it here. But I want to begin not in New York, but across the ocean in France in order to set the scene. It's the early months of 1700 in the naval port town of Brest, which you can see here on the right. This is the chateau there. The royal intendant received interesting news. A prisoner in a nearby jail was telling stories. The jail is there in the town of Landerneau on the left. The man was around 40 years old, and he claimed to be a Canadian named Mathieu Sagean. He had recently arrived in Brest and signed up as a soldier in a regiment, but he had quickly run afoul of the law for reasons we do not know. Once in jail, he started telling anyone who would listen about his rollicking adventures, which over the last 20 years had taken Sagean from Canada into the heart of North America and later across both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and back again. There was one episode in his travels that really stood out. His visit to a Native American kingdom located somewhere in the interior of America that he called Akaniba, a place of unimaginable wealth ruled by a powerful king who traded gold with Japan. This story briefly made Sagean a very popular man with the French imperial bureaucracy. Plucked from his prison, the intendant put Sagean into a very different and presumably more comfortable confinement in the Chateau de Brest, there on the right. He instructed his secretary, a man named Foscave, to interview Sagean and record his story, which resulted in a manuscript of more than 70 pages that now rests in the French National Archives. Now, when I stumbled on a version of this narrative on a trip to Paris a couple of years ago, I was utterly fascinated. Of course, I gravitated towards the details on the Akaniba, unlikely as they were, but there was another more obscure part of Sagean's story that also aroused my interest. After returning from the American interior, he had allegedly spent years in British America, where he arrived around the year 1689. He wandered from Maine to Delaware, and along the way witnessed a lot of the political turmoil in the colonies which surrounded England's glorious revolution, including, relevant to our purposes today, that in New York during the rule of a governor that he called Linsselear. Now, I wrote my first book on the colonies during the time of the Glorious Revolution, as you just heard, and I thought I had already read most of all the relevant sources, so finding a new one was very exciting indeed. I took furious notes as I worked through the pages of Sagean's narrative about the English colonies, hoping to find new insights. Now, after reading, though, I became a little bit disappointed, but mostly just puzzled. Sagean knew a lot about British America, from its geography to the names of particular notable people, not just governors, but judges and leading merchants. But his chronology was all wrong. He placed some people in places that they could not have been, and he completely botched the timeline of the war between Britain and France known as King William's War. Some of the details in Jacob Leisler's life, as we will see, were either incorrect or just quite unlikely. In short, it became clear to me that Sagean was far from a reliable source on Anglo-American political events, which perhaps was not surprising for a narrator who was most famous for inventing a vast native kingdom somewhere in present-day Nebraska. But once I realized that Sagean was not telling the whole truth, that only made me more interested. How did he get his knowledge? And what did the stories mean? Why even mention Jacob Leisler and the English colonies, which seemed at first glance to be very marginal to his overall story? And is it even possible for us to find out anything about the real Sagean and what he really did and saw? Those are the kinds of questions I want to try and answer today. And I admit that my answers are preliminary. Many of them are basically just hunches. But I think they do help us to understand not necessarily what happened in Leisler's New York, but what people thought happened in Leisler's New York, and how the English colonies and New York itself were part of a much larger imagined world, one that reached from the interior of North America to the Far East. My hypothesis is that Sagean's tale was not an eyewitness account, but a semi-fictional story that drew from what he had heard over his decades of travel, perhaps with some details from his life added here and there. He was an ordinary soldier and sailor, a semi-literate but exceptionally well-traveled man. Thus, we can use Sagean to get a kind of popular perspective on America and the wider world in the closing years of the 17th century. Now, of course, as I've already said, Sagean was a liar, but his lies were not random. Some of them were not even completely lies. They blended truth and fiction, and he intended his account to be at least believable. He needed to give the illusion of authority, which he did by peppering his extraordinary journey with enough likely details so the ministry officials listening to him did not send him back to prison. Now, before I do anything else, I want to tell Sagean's story, the way he told it himself. I will not include everything, of course, it was a very long story, but enough so we can get a sense of this character and where he claimed to have been over his 20 years of travel. I'm going to divide his adventure into 5 phases, and all of these are taken from the same map, which you already saw on my first slide. This is a map by a Parisian mapmaker named Guillaume de Lille that appeared in 1704. So it gives a sense of how the French imagined America to look at this time. My final map, which I'll get to later, is a different one, which I'll explain when I get there. So the first phase began around 1680, when the 20-year-old Sagean signed up to join a Western expedition led by his neighbor, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, better known as La Salle, who was tasked with exploring the Mississippi Valley in the name of France. Sagean claimed to accompany La Salle on his adventure, making it much of the way down the Mississippi before moving back north and helping to build Fort Saint-Louis, an outpost in what is now north-central Illinois, which you can see kind of in the corner of the map there. With La Salle gone back to France to ask for funding for future expeditions, the young Sagean got bored. He asked his commander if he could lead a small expedition of 11 Frenchmen and 2 Mohegan Indians to go adventuring. They set off to the north and west from the Illinois country. And we move on to phase 2. Ascending the Mississippi in canoes, the men eventually took a west turn on a smaller river. Then, while hunting one day, they found something extraordinary, a river running the opposite way towards the South Sea, or Pacific. The French had long been looking for a way to that fabled ocean, and Sagean seems to have found it. The men enthusiastically continued west. Soon they did find something remarkable, but it wasn't the ocean. It was a massive native kingdom, which Sagean called Aconiba. The men spent over 6 months living there, and Sagean described it in great detail. Aconiba stretched for miles. It included a large capital and many smaller towns, and was ruled by a king named Hagazin, who claimed to be a descendant of Moctezuma, the conquered Aztec emperor. Like his ancestor, Hagazin was surrounded by riches. The central square of the capital contained golden statues of the kingdom's founders, one of whom was riding a unicorn. The royal palace was also embossed with gold, which was indeed the kingdom's main trade good. They outfitted vast caravans of bison, who, loaded down with gold, went west to trade for iron with a distant nation that Sagean assumed to be the Japanese. Now, beyond all the gold, Akanibo was a paradise. It was always temperate, everything grew there, and the king absolutely loved the French visitors. He regaled them with feasts and offered them women. Sagean claimed that he refused the king's offer of his teenage daughter in marriage. When the French decided they wanted to return home, the king only granted them leave on the promise that they'd come back soon with French trade goods, especially shell and glass beads that Sagean referred to as trinkets. For good measure, Hagazin gave the men a staggering quantity of gold, which they loaded up into their canoes for the journey east. Thus began the third stage of Sagean's adventure, when things started to slowly go wrong. The men were in no mood to share their treasure or make anyone aware of it. They kept a low profile when they moved through several French outposts and took the back way to Montreal, but when they arrived, they found the city in distress. The nearby village of Lachine, which happened to be Sagean's hometown, had been struck by an Iroquois raid, killing his entire family and dozens of others. Mathieu and his returning companions went off on a brief raiding expedition to avenge their brethren before setting off again up the St. Lawrence. They hoped to find a ship that would take them to France, where they could presumably live well on their treasure. It didn't happen. Instead, they got captured, somewhere off the Acadian coast, by an English pirate named William Mason. Sagean had a very difficult time with English names. Mason tortured the men into revealing their treasure, killing more than half of them in the process. Sagean himself withstood the assault and somehow managed to hide some of the gold in his hair, which became the last of the treasure to remain. Mason eventually dropped the French survivors off the coast of Maine during the winter, barely clothed. Depending on the generosity of Wabanaki and English villagers, they made their way to Boston. The governor, Edmund Andros, attempted to enlist them in his assault against the Wabanakis in the French colony of Acadia, but being faithful French subjects, the men refused, and eventually got a passport from a local judge to leave, first to Newport and eventually to New York. In that colony, things got even more interesting. They met the governor, who Sagean identified as one of Linsselear, a Swiss merchant, and Sagean told him the sad story of how Mason had menaced them and taken their treasure. Leisler seemed sympathetic at first, but it was all a ruse. In fact, Sagean soon saw Mason himself, the pirate, on the streets of New York in the company of a woman who turned out to be Leisler's own daughter, who was allegedly his lover. More than that, Leisler had signed Mason's commission and was probably a beneficiary of part of the treasure. Clearly something was rotten in New York. In the meantime, Leisler sent Sagean upriver to Albany to participate in a treaty session with the Iroquois. He said he did so because Sagean spoke the Iroquois language, but the Frenchman believed it was just a way to get him out of New York, to keep Leisler's ties to the pirate Mason from becoming well known. Sagean said yes, so he could attempt to win the freedom of some French prisoners. He was able to succeed with a few, but the Iroquois killed and ate some of them in front of the horrified Sagean and the other emissaries, pledging their eternal hatred for France. Disappointed in his lack of success, Sagean returned to Manhattan. At this point, English politics caught up with him. A new governor arrived in New York, along with the news that England and France were now at war. Governor Leisler, according to Sagean, resisted handing power to the new governor and paid for it with his life. The new ruler, Henry Slaughter, interrogated the French, who told him all about Leisler's ties to piracy, but he refused to let the men go, instead putting them in prison in New York's fort. There they would stay, he said, until the war was done. Things became worse for Leisler when Slaughter unexpectedly died and was replaced by a new commander, who mostly forced the French prisoners to stay in isolation. Nonetheless, Sagean did have one interesting visitor in prison. It was one of the sons of the leading merchant Frederick Phillips. Sagean told the younger Phillips about his discoveries in the West, and the merchant made a proposition. He would furnish a fleet of ships to take Sagean to the mouth of the Mississippi, and from there into the interior, back to Akaniba. Together they would start a new colony, establish trade with King Hagazin, and become very, very rich. Of course, Sagean refused Phillips's kind offer. He was, as I said, a loyal French subject and would never lend his talents to a rival power. Soon after that, Sagean and one of his companions engineered an escape attempt by managing to get the soldiers guarding them drunk on rum. There was a lot of drinking in Sagean's area, and it usually didn't end well. With the aid of an enslaved woman in New Jersey who helped them steal her master's canoe, they made it to Philadelphia and then to Newcastle, Delaware, where they bought a boat. Somehow Sagean had still had some of that gold that he had squirreled away in his hair a couple years earlier. On the way back to New France, though, bad luck struck. They got taken by an English pirate, again. This one, whose last name was Cross, was not as cruel as Mason. He just brought Sagean and his companions onto his crew, not willingly, in Sagean's report, and soon they were off pirating. So begins the last phase of Sagean's adventures, which requires me to use another now, because as you can see, he went pretty much everywhere. This was the longest in terms of time and distance, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. Cross raided around the Caribbean and in the Azores and Canary Islands, where they unfortunately plundered a ship carrying wine. The silly pirates then became very drunk, here again we see the dangers of alcohol, and wrecked their ship. Sagean ended up with a few survivors on a sandbar where he once again witnessed cannibalism. This time it was his pirate companions who tried to serve him broiled pieces of one of their Irish companions, claiming it to be turtle meat. Sagean wisely refused, and eventually they made it to the Cape Verde Islands, where they took up with yet another privateer, this one a Frenchman named Leisler. This ship was in turn defeated by a New England pirate named Glover off the African coast, who then forced Sagean to join his crew and go pirating in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Eventually, Sagean escaped this pirate, had some adventures in India that I won't get into, and joined a British East India Company ship heading east. After yet another shipwreck, this one on Taiwan, Sagean finally found his way back to London, arriving there in 1699, and soon continuing on to Brest. His treasure gone, and having little to show for his years of piracy, Sagean signed up with a Marine regiment, hoping to find some way back to America. Then he ended up in prison, and then in the intendant's chateau, where he learned that his story could be as valuable as any treasure. Now, for the historian looking at Sagean's narrative, the first question is pretty much the same one that officials in the French Ministry of the Marine were asking. Could this be true? I'll tell you a bit later what the ministry thought, but first I'll go through my own assessment, guided by my knowledge of the period and the good work of some other scholars who have sought to follow up on some of Sagean's claims. The summary answer is that there is a little truth and a lot of lies, but to get more specific, we have to return to the 5 stages of the journey I mentioned before. Stage 1 was perhaps a little true, but it's hard to tell. There's no record of a Sagean family in New France's vital records, which are really quite good, and no one by that name is recorded as being with LaSalle in Illinois. And there are some mistakes in Sagean's timeline of the events of LaSalle's expedition. But for reasons that I will get into, it is possible, maybe even likely, that some of those adventures really happened. Stage 2, the trip to Aconiba, was obviously a fabrication. No such place existed or could exist in the American West, and Sagean seems to have pieced it together by drawing on popular tropes from European legends mixed with a name, Coniba, that appeared on many American maps. With the trip to Aconiba being fiction, the trip home, stage 4, must have been mostly made up as well, but maybe with a few glimmers of truth. Jumping ahead a little bit, the final stage, stage 5, seems to have been mostly true, especially the later portions. We can verify much of it. The pirates and privateers he mentioned really existed, and we can even confirm the itinerary of the East India Company ship he took back to London. So of all the parts of the narrative, Sagean's adventures in the East are the most likely to have happened more or less as he reported. That leaves stage 4, the trip to the British American colonies. On one hand, Sagean's knowledge of Anglo-American geography and politics was quite good. He got the place names right, although he frequently mangled the English and Dutch names. He knew the names of officials, from Edmund Andros, the governor of New England, and Benjamin Bullivant, the Boston judge who gave him a passport, to Leisler and Phillips in New York. Such in-depth knowledge would suggest that Sagean did not just invent his travels there. But looking deeper, the story quickly falls apart. Let's look at chronology. Sagean claimed he returned to Montreal right after the Iroquois attack on Lachine. That event happened on August 5th, 1689. If he then spent a few months wandering around getting revenge and whatnot, that would put his fateful encounter with the pirate William Mason on the coast of Acadia sometime in the fall of 1689, and his arrival in Boston sometime during the winter of 1689-90. He mentioned how cold it was. But Edmund Andros was deposed in April 1689 in Boston's local version of the Glorious Revolution, and by that fall he was in prison awaiting transportation back to England. Judge Benjamin Bullivant was also out of power and had no power to give anyone a passport, so Sagean could not have been in Boston at the time he claimed to be. Regarding New York, by his timeline he would have arrived there sometime in the summer of 1690, which was indeed during Leisler's administration, and stayed until sometime in the fall of 1691, after the death of Henry Sloughter, spending the winter of 1691-92 in Newcastle, Delaware. The main problem with this timeline is what Sagean says about the war, King William's War. He claims that the declaration of war came with Henry Slaughter's arrival, but in fact the two nations had been fighting for nearly 2 years at that point. Indeed, the main preoccupation in the summer of 1690, when Sagean supposedly arrived, was Leisler's attempted expedition against Montreal, one that led to a protracted struggle over strategy with authorities in Albany. Sagean would have surely heard about the failure of that expedition, as well as the failed sea assault from Boston to Quebec that occurred in October 1690. But none of that appears in Sagean's narrative. If he really was in New York in 1690 to 91, he either forgot what had happened or was fudging the details. So what do we make of all this? My feeling is that most of the events he describes in New York did not really happen. I don't think he met with Leisler. I don't think he went as an envoy to the Iroquois. I don't think he ever went to prison. But at the same time, I think he was very familiar with New York in ways that could only mean he had spent time there, or was intimately familiar with those who had. And I think he very well might have been there in the 1690s, just not doing what he claimed to be doing. Now, my theory rests on two key hypotheses. The first one is that Sagean was a coureur de bois. So what does this mean exactly? The literal definition from French is woods runner, or runner of the woods, but it really meant illegal fur trader. But that really doesn't do the term justice, since the coureur de bois was a cultural phenomenon as much as it was an occupation. Of course, the fur trade was the most lucrative pursuit in early Canada, but French authorities carefully controlled it. Sometimes they offered a limited number of permits to selected people who would go off into the backcountry and trade for furs. There was always more demand than supply, though, so many people would sneak off anyway, becoming coureur de bois. At other times, authorities banned the trade altogether in an attempt to encourage the people of New France to become farmers and stay in the St. Lawrence Valley, meaning that essentially all fur traders were coureur de bois. Now, obviously, the existence of these coureur de bois rankled French leaders. They cost the crown money, but they also embodied a spirit of independence and rebellion that was all too common in French Canada. The key risk was that after disappearing into the country, the coureur de bois would essentially turn into Indians. Many of them lived among the natives, spoke their languages, adopted their customs, even married native women and had children with them. The French even coined a term for this, ensauvagement, basically turning into a sauvage, a quote-unquote savage. To show this process and the worry it caused, look at one incident from Fort Crèvecoeur, which was the predecessor of Fort Saint-Louis, where Sagean was stationed in Illinois. In 1680, LaSalle left a few men to hold on to Crèvecoeur while they built their new fort upriver. When his representatives returned, though, they found that the men had deserted, and they had left a message behind scrawled on an abandoned boat, which read, "Nous sommes tous sauvages," we are all savages. Essentially, the soldiers had chosen the carefree life of the coureur de bois over the rigors of the military and disappeared into the woods to live with and live like the natives. This was not an unusual choice among LaSalle's men, who had in-depth knowledge of the West and Native American customs. Now, in a moment of accidental honesty, Sagean basically admitted in his deposition that he had been a coureur de bois. On the supposed return from Acaniba to Montreal in 1689, he noted that the governor of New France had issued a pardon for any coureur de bois who would return home, implying that they were in part responding to that invitation. Beyond that, he gave all sorts of signs that he was a coureur de bois. His narrative repeatedly demonstrated close familiarity with native customs, and he identified his French-Canadian friends not with their given names, but their Algonquin nom de guerre, which demonstrated what the French would have called un sauvagement. Sagean's name was routine, which he said meant the wind. He wasn't that far off. The actual word is notine. It is worth considering if Sagean was one of the self-proclaimed sauvages who had deserted from Fort Crèvecoeur in 1680. If he had really been among La Salle's men, he would have at least known these people. The leader of the gang, a soldier named Martin Chartier, took up with the Shawnees and married one of their women, spending years traipsing around the Ohio Valley before showing up in Maryland in 1693. The arrival of a Frenchman and his native friends during the height of war between Britain and France set off some alarm bells, but he was not there to fight, but to trade. Like many coureurs de bois, he was drawn to the higher prices the British would pay for furs, and he soon set up a partnership with Pierre Biséon, another Frenchman who had served in the West, but by the early 1690s had set himself up in business in Pennsylvania. Now, we of course have no idea if Sagean knew these two characters, but there are some small pieces of evidence in the narrative that he might have. First, Sagean seems to have stolen a family story from Martin Chartier. Sagean claimed that when he returned to Canada in 1689, he found that his family had perished in the Lachine massacre. This is puzzling, since there's no demographic source linking Sagean to Lachine at all, and no one in the list of casualties who seem like they could be his family. The person who did lose family in the assault was Martin Chartier, his father and two brothers. We have no evidence that Chartier attempted to avenge them, but his movements during that time period are somewhat mysterious. It is altogether possible that Chartier told Sagean the story of his lost family members, and Sagean simply adopted it as his own. The second tidbit concerns the town of Newcastle, Delaware, where Sagean spent his last winter in English America before going off on his global adventure. Pierre Biséon, Chartier's partner, eventually settled in Newcastle, along with a few other French people active in Western trade. If Sagean was indeed there, it's hard to imagine they didn't have some connection. But what does all this have to do with New York? Well, Biséon and Chartier's partner in this business was another Frenchman named Gédéon Petit. Originally a Protestant from La Rochelle, he had converted to Catholicism in order to move to New France during the 1660s. He moved to Montreal, where he was employed, according to the governor, in running a house of ill repute. Aside from his main job, though, Petit seems to have contracted heavily with coureurs de bois and trafficked in illegal furs. In 1687, he decided to go into that business full-time and abandoned Montreal for Albany. The reasons were twofold. Petit and his partners, Biséon and Chartier included, could get much better prices for their furs in Albany than in Montreal. Second, Petit was a Protestant, and he could freely practice his faith in New York. During the 1680s, authorities back in France had begun to persecute Protestants, leading many of them to flee the country. New France was a little different. Protestantism had not been legal there for decades, but many Huguenots lived there anyway, mostly keeping quiet but well known to authorities. Now that persecution was on the rise, more of these people were leaving, and the relatively easy canoe highway down Lake Champlain was getting more and more crowded. All of this meant that New York was filled with French people in the 1680s, both former coureurs de bois, religious refugees, and some people who were both. For a coureur de bois like Sagean, New York was an important market, and it was filled with friends and acquaintances. It is unlikely that someone like him would not have spent time there as a visitor or even a temporary resident. And even if he didn't, he undoubtedly heard stories of the place, including the twists and turns of its politics, which surely affected the fur trade. Thus, it is not surprising that Sagean could have given Foscave, the secretary, a pretty accurate rendering of events in the colony, even if he had not been there to witness them all. So that's my first big hypothesis, that Sagean was a coureur de bois, and that brought him to New York. But my second hypothesis is in some ways more important in terms of the type of information he had about the colony. In addition to being a coureur de bois, I believe Sagean was also a pirate. Or at least he served as a crew on pirate ships. It was this occupation of very deep, dubious legality that took him around the world in the 1690s, and it was also how he got much of his knowledge about New York, which might be seen as one of the centers, if not the center, of the piratical world at that time. Now, Sagean admitted that he spent a lot of time with privateers and pirates. There were 4 separate stretches. The first with William Mason, who supposedly took him and his friends prisoner and terrorized them. Then with John Cross, who essentially forced Sagean and his one remaining companion to join his crew. The Frenchman Leisler, who came across the desperate Sagean in Cape Verde and brought him aboard his ship. And then Richard Glover, who defeated Leisler in battle and then took his crew as his own. Some of this may have been true, but I think Sagean also told one very big lie. He tried to portray himself as a reluctant pirate, but overall as a loyal French subject. He repeatedly noted his refusal to serve in expeditions against his home country. This was almost certainly a lie. In fact, he spent most of the 1690s serving on privateering expeditions against France. Eager to hide this fact from the Ministry of the Marine, Sagean was very vague and evasive about his actual activities on his world tour. But I think we can read between the lines. The most interesting thing about Sagean's pirate stories is his ability to correctly identify so many privateers and pirates. All 4 of the captains in question can be traced in other sources, and operated roughly in the places and the times that Sagean placed them. I will focus on 2 of them, the first and the last, because they best demonstrate the links between the pirate diaspora and the colony of New York. First, the tyrant William Mason. We don't know much about his origins, but he did in fact receive a privateering commission from Jacob Leisler in May 1690, during the early stages of the war. His first activities under the commission were to raid ships off the coast of Acadia, which seems to have been a common pursuit during the period. In fact, New France's governor, Frontenac, mentioned that a pirate was raiding off the coast even in the fall of 1689, in the same letter when he told his bosses in France about the Iroquois raid on Lachine. Who knows if that was Mason? It would have been before he received his commission, but we do know that he took 6 French ships in the summer and fall of 1690, including one called L'Espérance, which he then registered with officials in New York. After 1690, much of the action in the war moved south into the Caribbean and then across the Atlantic, and Mason seems to have followed it. By 1693, he, like many of the privateers and pirates associated with New York, was spending most of his time in the Indian Ocean, where the line between privateering, which was supposedly sort of legal, and outright piracy, which was certainly not, got very blurry. The Indian Ocean pirates established a base of operations on the island called Sainte Marie off the coast of Madagascar, and raided Mughal and Arab ships from the Red Sea to India. The most famous of these pirates was a man named Henry Avery, whose 1695 capture of a Mughal ship taking pilgrims to Mecca made him the world's most wanted fugitive. Mason was an associate of Avery on his expeditions. It is very possible that Sagean told the truth about being captured on the coast of Acadia by William Mason. Perhaps he was a passenger or crew member on the L'Espérance in August 1690, or one of the other ships. But the pirates certainly did not torture Sagean in search of a treasure that didn't exist. The descriptions of Mason's cruelties sound like they were clearly inspired by the reports in the recently published book, The Buccaneers of America, which remained the most famous description of piracy. Rather, I think that Sagean joined Mason's crew and spent some years menacing his own people, a fact that he was loath to share with Foscave and Brest. If he served under Mason, Sagean would have known about his commission from Leisler. Did the captain or some of his men also share bawdy stories about how Mason had not only secured the commission, but also romanced Leisler's daughter? That sounds like something a pirate might do, whether or not the story was true. Sagean could have followed Mason on his adventures in the Indian Ocean, but it's more likely that he simply linked with the itinerant pirate and privateering crews that operated out of New York and eventually left for the Caribbean and the East. Sagean's final pirate captain, Richard Glover, was another member of this network. Like Mason, Glover worked as a privateer during the war, but his commission came from Benjamin Fletcher, who took over as New York's governor after the death of Henry Slaughter in 1692. There was probably no executive in the empire more willing to promote piracy, which became something of a scandal after Fletcher left office. Like so many others, Glover seems to have combined semi-legitimate attacks on French ships with very much illegal ones on everybody else. And he also spent time in Madagascar, just as Sagean reported. We have no outside confirmation of Glover's battle with the French privateer Leisler, which Sagean supposedly witnessed, but it seems plausible. A deposition places Glover in Madagascar in August 1695, which would seem to match Sagean's chronology. By the end of the decade, both Glover and Mason seem to have died. Piracy in the Indian Ocean was a deadly business. So it makes sense that Sagean would have moved on to other employment, taking up with the British East India Company ships in a quest to make enough money to get home. It was not at all unusual for mariners to move back and forth from legitimate to illegitimate employers. In fact, William Mason himself signed on with the East India Company for a time. And surely Sagean had picked up some relevant skills in nearly a decade on the sea. There are two more clues that suggest Sagean's pirate ties. One is his story about Frederick Phillips's son visiting him in prison and proposing a joint venture to find the Akaniba treasure. Phillips was one of New York's richest merchants, if not the richest, and was well known to be a primary benefactor to the New York pirates, who paid him off generously. He also had trading links to the French in Acadia. He had 8 sons, so it's hard to know which one Sagean was referencing, but several were also involved in their father's business activities. While it's unlikely that a common crew member would have known Phillips, any New York pirate would have known his name and history. Finally, there's one more mysterious piece of information that suggests Sagean's pirate links. When Sagean's story began circulating around Brest in early 1700, a local merchant captain came forward with some interesting news. Sometime around 1697, the merchant, whose name was Leisler, had been on the French island of Martinique, where he encountered a strange man telling a story. A tale about discovering a city of gold in the American interior, of being captured by a pirate, of escaping from prison in New York and then being forced on to yet another pirate crew. He had managed to escape on the island of Antigua, stole a canoe, and eventually made it to Martinique, and he was now seeking passage to France. Now, when they heard this story, ministry officials thought they had found trace of one of Sagean's companions, someone who could verify his story and prove that Akaniba really existed. But there's a simpler explanation. This was Sagean himself. His years on pirate crews took him on a rollicking back and forth journey from North America to the Caribbean, to Africa, Madagascar, and India, and back again. Leisler left port without the strange passenger and didn't think much of him until he heard similar stories back in Brest in 1700. Rather than going back to France, the man must have signed on to another privateering crew, heading back to the Indian Ocean for the final journey that would take him to India, China, and eventually to Brittany. So according to my theory, Sagean spent the better part of 20 years on the wrong side of the law. He came of age as an illegal fur trader, working between empires in an open defiance of French imperial policy. No surprise, then, that he would also be tempted by piracy, a sure, if dangerous way for a young man to make some money. These years as a coureur de bois and as a pirate brought him little stable wealth, but lots of information, which allowed him to fabricate a life story that avoided all the inconvenient details about how he had traipsed back and forth across empires. Instead, he just made up that he spent a few years in the English colonies, giving just enough details to sound credible and stressing his faithfulness to the land of his birth. The coureur de bois turned pirate became a loyal Frenchman, just trying to share news of a fabulous treasure with the king and his ministers. So now that I've revealed my theory, well, most of it, what happened next? Foscave sent Sagean's deposition to Versailles, and various officials and America experts began debating its veracity. These men were not idiots. They could tell that this guy might not be everything he claimed to be. But the existence of Leisler's confirmation gave them pause. If there was any chance that Akaniba might be real, the French wanted to be the ones who found it. So Sagean was transferred from Brest to Rochefort, where he faced questioning from a man named Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville, who was a Canadian military leader who was in the process of founding the colony of Louisiana. The interview apparently created more doubts, but Sagean performed well enough to earn a one-way ticket to Louisiana to help plan a new expedition to Akaniba. The intendant of Rochefort admitted that it was possible Sagean was lying, but even if he didn't find Akaniba, he would probably find something else. In May 1701, Sagean arrived in the brand new French outpost in Biloxi. Once there, the mask quickly came off. Many people in Biloxi had deep experience in the West, and they poked holes in Sagean's story. And soon he was in custody once again, this time in the commander's headquarters. Moreover, many of the people in Biloxi did remember the newcomer, but they didn't remember him as Mathieu Sagean. He had been an engagé in the West. An engagé was basically an indentured servant in the French Empire. But he had gone by a different name, the name Marmont. Now this new name, this new clue, will allow me to present my last piece of circumstantial evidence. As I said, there's no record of anyone named Sagean in the Canadian archives. There is no Marmont either, but there is a Marmont, which given 17th century orthography is probably close enough. His name was actually Pierre Montgeras de Marmont, with the D, D-I-T, meaning that Marmont was his nickname. It apparently referred to his hometown, which was in Guyenne, just up the Garonne River from Bordeaux. Montgeras arrived as a soldier in New France in the late 1660s and married a woman named Marguerite David in 1674. 4 years later, we see him in the colonial records of New York. Along with his father-in-law, Montgeras led an expedition to return several English prisoners who had been captured by French allied Native Americans. On their arrival in New York, Montgeras and his father-in-law revealed to the English commander that they wanted to move to the colony. They didn't say why, but apparently the David family, including Montgeras's wife, were Protestants. Soon almost all of the Davids, including Montgeras himself, had relocated to the Hudson Valley, settling at first in the town of Kingston. They attended the local Dutch Reformed Church and eventually changed their name to Montrose to sound more English. Pierre lived until 1703, and his wife Marguerite much longer, with the family becoming a fixture in the Hudson Valley in the 18th century. Marguerite's father, Guillaume David, who was the one who had accompanied Pierre Montgeras on the original expedition to New York, ended up moving to Martinique, where he died in 1698. So did Mathieu Sagean, de Marmont, have a connection with Pierre Montgeras, de Marmont? Could Pierre have been his older brother or cousin, or just a hometown acquaintance? Could young Mathieu have followed Pierre to Canada? As I've been saying so often, we can't know for sure, but there's certainly a lot of coincidences. For one thing, Sagean included in his story a fictitious prisoner exchange in Albany. Could it have been based on a very real prisoner exchange conducted by Montgeras back in 1678? Depending on when exactly he went west, Mathieu could even have accompanied that expedition as a boy. This would also help to explain once more Sagean's familiarity with New York. Having kin or friends in the colony would have given Sagean a place to stay there, and connections that he could use to find employment, whether in trading furs or heading out to sea. So given all of this admittedly circumstantial evidence, I want to venture my own guess as to Mathieu Sagean's real story. I think he was not Canadian, but came to New France as a boy or a teenager following his older relative. Lacking opportunities, he signed up as an engagé, an indentured servant, to go west in the company of Leisler, a lowly servant to one of the colony's famous men, the kind of person who blended in and didn't leave much of an impression. Tempted by the dreams of riches and freedom related by people like Martin Chartier and Pierre Biséon, he disappeared into the backcountry, becoming a coureur de bois for most of the 1680s. During these years, he crossed much of the continent, perhaps even visiting his relatives in New York. Then he responded to the amnesty granted to coureurs de bois in 1689, but he didn't stay long in New France. Instead, he ended up in the employ of William Mason, fighting against his own people in the war. Not surprising if some of his family members were Protestants who had already defected. Moving on, he spent most of the 1690s on various pirate ships, moving between the Caribbean, Africa, and the Indian Ocean, finally as far as China. By the end of all these travels, Sagean wanted nothing more than to get back to America, so he concocted a story that he thought might get him there, a tale that drew some details from his own life, others from the lives of those around him, and others that he had just heard over his decades of travel, related around campfires, or on the decks of a ship, or in a tavern in some port. Once he told the story in Brest, he found that it did the trick. He did get his one-way ticket back to America. After 1701, we have only two more traces of Sagean. One came from 1717 in a map of the French town of Mobile, which you can see here. There's a house lot, which I've marked in yellow there, highlighted, belonging to a Mathieu Sagean, S-A-J-A-N. 5 years later, the Jesuit explorer Pierre-Charles Xavier de Charlevoix heard a rumor that Sagean had moved to Havana in Cuba and tried to track him down, still tempted by his stories of Western travels. Charlevoix never found Sagean, but I like to imagine him in Havana as an elderly man in the corner of some dark tavern telling wild stories about Indians and pirates to anyone who would listen. So this is my story, or his story, or my story of his story. So all that's left is to explain why I think it matters, and to justify why I've spent dozens, if not hundreds of hours thinking about Sagean over the last 2 years. Why spend so much time with someone who was most certainly a liar? It should be clear that we historians can't trust him any more than ministry officials could back in 1700. Nonetheless, I think there are 3 reasons why his story is not just an interesting one, but an important one. First off, Sagean's narrative is a compendium of stories. Some of them probably came from his own life, but it's hard for us to know which ones without corroboration from other sources, which are pretty hard to find. Others may have come from his friends and relations, Chartier's stories of his lost family, Monteras's prisoner exchange, who knows what else. Even the more unlikely parts, like the lost kingdom of Aconiba, probably represented stories that circulated around North America between natives and Europeans. People had been sharing tales about lost native kingdoms for centuries and would continue to do so well into the 18th century. All in all, these stories matter not because they represented any sort of reality, but because they showed what people at the time believed could be true. America was a land of wonder, a land of mystery, a place for these wild stories. Second, I think that Sagean's narrative is a great chronicle of the connections that held early America together and linked it to other places. We see connections between French fur traders and their native allies, connections between these same fur traders and merchants in New York and other parts of English America. More connections linked English North America to the Caribbean, to Africa and Asia. These connections were forged by merchants, pirates, and ordinary sailors. The networks created by these connections easily crossed imperial and ethnic lines, and even oceans. They were anchored by commercial alliances and by family and religious ties. We often try to see colonial histories as separate. There was New France, New England, New York, but they were intimately connected, both with each other and with places far beyond. The fact that a barely literate French Canadian could know so much about English America should remind us about the importance of all of these connections. Finally, Sagean's story tells us something about New York in particular. In this world of stories, this world of networks and connections, all roads seem to lead to this one place. In fact, I think it's not incorrect to say that New York was the node that held everything together. It was the chief conduit between English America and the French and native world of the interior. The furs, people, and stories of the American West flowed into the colony, mostly by way of Albany, thanks to the myriad connections with the French world. Then at the other end of the Hudson Valley, ships sailing from the port of New York connected this interior American world with a whole other one stretching as far as East Asia. New York could appear to be an insignificant colony, a marginal part of the slowly developing British Empire, but it was really something much more important, a critical meeting point between East and West. Thank you. I'm happy to answer some questions if anyone has. Whoa.
So,
yes?
You know, in his look for, what was the place he was looking for in gold?
Coniba?
Yeah, what about Coronado and his searching 200 years, 150 years earlier, looking for the same pot of gold in the same area?
Yep, yes. Coronado and kind of Marcos de Niza was kind of the first to theorize about cities of gold in the interior of North America with Cibola, and then Quivira, which was kind of moved around in location over the years, was sometimes in the Great Plains, sometimes in the far west. But there are many more too. There's this is actually my next book will hopefully be about all of these different stories of great, rich civilizations in the interior of North America. There was the kingdom of Saguenay that Cartier tried to find up in Canada. There was the country of Appalachia, which is where the name for the Appalachian Mountains comes from, which was supposed to be filled with gold and great cities. So yes, there were many, many of these stories. And I think that Sagean was picking up on, I think all of, some of them were, I've traced some of the sources of them. Some of them come from European travel narratives about the East, for instance, places like the Kingdom of Prester John or the Great Khan. But I think there are also native stories that are being incorporated, and it's kind of a melange of all of them. Yes?
Could you explain what a privateer is compared to a pirate?
Yes. So basically a privateer, during times of war, authorities, whether it's authorities back in Europe or a colonial governor, will issue what's called a letter of marque or a commission to basically make a private ship kind of a fighting force for the colony or for the mother country. And so they'll go off and they'll kind of have the right, supposedly, to raid ships belonging to the enemy. So that was a way that basically the state could not pay for the war, but they would kind of allow these private individuals to do it for them.
Then the privateers would keep the whatever.
They would keep most of it, and then they would give a little bit back to the person who commissioned them.
Right.
So the privateers and the pirates were usually the same people. So they would receive commissions or letters of marque from time to time. That didn't mean that they would just limit themselves to the enemy ships like they were supposed to. They might take other ships as well. Or when their commission expired, they would go off and just turn into pirates. So the terms are often kind of used together because privateers could become pirates and vice versa. But so the privateers were at least kind of officially sanctioned by the state, whereas pirates were just acting totally on their own.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Staying with the pirates and the privateers, because you went back and forth on whether he was a pirate or whether he was a privateer.
Mm-hmm.
Did he have letters of marque? That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, you really tore New York apart when you said that we were literally the center of piracy. We're going, wow, what made us the center of piracy in the 1690s? Third part, you mentioned Phillips, very wealthy family in New York. Were they like the Hancock family? Did a lot of their wealth come from privateering?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And on a private note, you're awfully comfortable there. Are you literate in the French language? Did you do a lot of the studying that you would have had to do for your book, actually doing in French
mm-hmm.
as opposed to English?
Mm-hmm. Yes, all of these sources are in French.
Wow.
Like Sagean's narrative, there have been small parts of it that have been translated into English, but the longer one is only in French. So yeah.
So why were we a center of piracy? I'm not letting you off the hook.
So that's a good question. I mean, I can kind of explain how, but I'm not sure if I entirely know why. I mean, English colonies in general were quite accepted piracy quite a lot because a lot of it had to do with the economics of empire. So because of the Navigation Acts, which tried to make it so that all goods from the colonies had to go back to England on English ships to try to. It was arranged actually to keep the Dutch out of the colonial trade because they handled so much of the trade themselves. So the Navigation Acts made it hard to acquire a lot of goods in English colonies in the 17th century, and pirates would basically bring in those goods and sell them at decent prices. So a lot of people who lived in English colonies, not just New York, but also Rhode Island, where I live, was a pirate nest as well, and South Carolina for a time, and Jamaica for a time. They would allow all of these pirates to basically hang out there because they would provide lots of cheap goods. But then you also had a number of officials who would then try to get in on the action. So Benjamin Fletcher, who I mentioned, who's the governor later in the 1690s, was kind of famous for this. He would basically, even though basically every governor was told, one of the things you should do is root out the pirates. many of them would get to America and they find their salaries were pretty low and they could actually make quite a bit of money if they just kind of turned a blind eye or even gave commissions to the pirates to become kind of privateers and then be sort of legitimate. And New York seems to have had a few people that were, a few officials, including Leisler to an extent, but especially Fletcher, who were willing to do this. And then the last thing, which I think relates to your question about Phillips, is that there were just merchants with connections all over who could fund a lot of this. And Phillips was certainly, I mean, I'm not an expert on Phillips, but a lot of his money, I think, came from these ties to piracy. I've seen him described as the king of the pirates because he funded so many of them. Did I get all your questions, or was there one that I missed?
Yeah, you did very good. Even made New York look halfway decent.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fun to be the center of piracy. It's like I come from a town in the Pacific Northwest, a little seaport town, and if you go to the souvenir shops on Front Street, they all want to sell these like Coopville pirate things. Like there weren't any pirates here, So New York should be proud. Yes.
Was the river that flowed to the west ever identified? That was part of his story?
It didn't exist. There's no way it could exist. So basically, like, if we take him at his word, the river flowing west would have been kind of somewhere in the Dakotas or Nebraska, which just was way on the wrong side of the Continental Divide. I think so there were constant rumors of something called, the French were always talking about a place called the Western Sea, the Mer de l'Ouest, and the Western River, the Rivière de l'Ouest, which they usually heard from kind of vague reports from their native friends of these places. The Western Sea was a kind of inland sea connected to the Pacific that was salt water, that had lots of people living on it, that could trade with Asia, and the river would take you there. And I think that these were kind of vague references probably to the Columbia Snake River system, which people kind of heard about from someone who would talk to someone who had been there, because Native American trade networks reached all the way across the continent.
And wasn't it also part of the Lewis and Clark narrative at some point?
Yeah, well later, I mean, they would be the ones who actually figured out how to get there. But yeah, even in the 17th century, so in the 1670s, 1680s, they were already hearing about this. And if you look at these, like this map from 1703, they still have, not all the details are right on there, but they know a lot about what's going on in the far west. When I first started studying these maps, I was really just amazed at the level of detail. And most of this, I mean, a few French fur trappers had been out to this area and Jesuit missionaries, but most of it comes from native informants. So they're basically talking to their native friends and trading partners. So what's over there? What's further down the road? And that's how they piece together the edges of the map.
Have you compared any of this to the Red Sky Scrolls?
To what?
The Red Sky Scrolls.
Oh, I don't know those. What are they? Tell me about them.
Wow, now I'm gonna, there's a scroll that was produced by from native notes that shows basically the same kind of path. And I think it dates to the early 1600s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that, but I'd like to know it.
Any other questions?
Is this a book? Is this a book that you're writing?
So the book that I'm writing is about basically imaginary places in North America. So that's where Sagean's story fits in. So this will be one very small part of that, but kind of answering the first question, like Cibola will be in there too, and Quivira, and many other places.
Okay. Very, very interesting concept.
Thank you.
It's an interesting detective story too.
That's what makes it fun. I just, and you know, when I found this particular story, I wasn't looking for it. In fact, I was in Paris doing a research trip on a completely different subject, and I ran out of things to read, so I just went. It was actually the papers of the guy, the map maker who made this. I was like, oh, I'll look through his papers. It'll be kind of fun. You know, pass an afternoon. And then I found this thing, and I've fallen down a rabbit hole, and now I became obsessed with it. So it was a chance discovery, which of course lots of other people already knew about. I mean, it had even been published in French, but I hadn't encountered it before.
We good? All right, thank you so much, Owen.